Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to kick it over to Debbie Hamill, IAOP CEO. Debbie, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is brought to you by Colliers International, a leader in corporate real estate and a founding member of IAOP. It's through the support of companies like Colliers that we're able to bring you the programs like these to helpfully make your jobs a little easier and get you through what continues to be a challenging time. Today's session could not be more relevant or timely. Members of Colliers Consulting, Technology, and Marketing leadership teams discuss future scenarios for the office on how and where employees might be working in 2025. And to get us started, please allow me to introduce Chris Slotke, EVP and Head of Client Experience at Colliers. Chris, it's all yours.
Thanks, Debbie, and thanks, IAOP, for allowing us the opportunity to share our insights. We wanted to take you out of your day-to-day working, where I think a majority of you are probably still challenged or are working on COVID-related issues, as well as trying to figure out, how do I manage the future, or where are we going with our business, with the work we're doing, with how we keep our employees engaged, and certainly how the workplace and the portfolio supports that. So in taking you out of that mindset, we wanted to introduce to you a scenario planning methodology that we developed, which is really focused on looking at the future of where your real estate might be headed, how work supports that. And we wanted to take you 5 years out. So give you a reprieve from where you are today, but push you into a mindset to think about the future. So we're really excited to dig in, and I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity to have developed over the last 2 months a working relationship or working with the team that you see here. As Debbie mentioned, it's a multidisciplinary team made up of our subject matter experts from consulting, technology, and marketing. With that, I'll turn it over to Linda. And so maybe you could provide an introduction of your background and the role you played on the team.
Hi, this is Linda White. I'm head of our technology services based out of the Atlanta office. Obviously not there today, despite my colorful background. And I have responsibility for, in this session, of looking at the change in our technology landscape as we're looking out in the future, and how that change in technology is going to influence how our teams behave, how they do their day-to-day job, and ultimately influence how we set up our real estate solutions. Ron?
Hi, my name is Ron Zappilli. I am the head of portfolio strategy for Colliers in the Americas. My role on this team essentially is to help the team members understand the impacts to different real estate models as you move through the different scenarios that we've laid out. Brett?
Thanks, Ron. Good morning, everyone. Brett Slango. I lead the workforce analytics group here in the Americas for Colliers. My role here, as you might guess from the title, is related to thinking through what are the implications for, the labor force of both today and the future, as we think through, what the world is going to look like as we come through this COVID situation. Keith?
Thanks, Brett. So I'm Keith Persky. I lead the workplace advisory practice for the Americas. We're a team of people who deliver workplace services to large occupiers and small occupiers. My role on this was to really think about what is the impact on the workplace, both inside and out. Greg.
Hey, I'm Greg Healy. I head Colliers Location Strategy Consulting practice based in Southern California. In this exercise, my role was really pulling things together, looking at it kind of holistically, looking at all the different scenarios. What signposts do we have? What changes do we need to make? Melody.
Hi, I'm Melody Lavi. I'm the director of our Business Development Center here in the US. My role in this team is to bring perspective of these scenarios on brand and on culture. Francesco?
Thank you, Melody. I'm Francesco De Camilli, and I lead flexible workspace consulting for Colliers in the Americas. And my role in this exercise was really to help us understand how flexible workspace may play a key role in supporting the occupier portfolio mix of tomorrow.
All right, thanks everyone. And I'll be your moderator today. And my role is to to help facilitate the development of the scenarios, as well as keep this high-performing team on track. So with that, I'll turn it over to Keith, and maybe Keith, can you provide a little bit of the rationale or some insight on the rationale of why we took this on and why we thought it was important?
Great. Thanks, Chris. Obviously, the whole COVID-19 episode that we're experiencing right now has caused us to really rethink a lot of things. In particular, what is the workplace? What is the portfolio? What is the purpose of place? We found that we've been able to successfully, by and large, work in a remote way. And it's caused a lot of us, including a lot of our clients, to ask the questions, what do I need this space for? And if I have it, what is it? What's its function? And so it's really caused us to think about, is culture, is work, are other aspects of work really dependent on a location, or can they be free of a location? And so we embarked on this. We realized that the future is still a little bit blurry. There's a lot of ways that this future could unfold. And every month we get clearer and clearer ideas about what's going to happen. But in response, then we said, let's think about this from a scenario perspective. What are 4 possible futures that could happen? And then what are the signposts that'll show up to give us an idea about which future is going to occur? And then how can we prepare for those? Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. So in setting this up, what we looked at are a couple different parameters that we'd want to be able to measure and understand the impact of the scenario. On the x-axis, we looked at what's the likelihood of a scenario unfolding. So something from, for instance, low change or status quo, all the way up to high change, which is something evolutionary. We also, relative to that, on the y-axis, we look at the impact. What would be the impact of any of these scenarios unfolding to your business, the way you work, the way you occupy real estate? So for instance, the other 2 scenarios playing it out, if you were to look at low likelihood and high impact, this tends to be the innovation space where we see a lot of disruption, technology coming into play, the ability to drive change. In the upper right, which is where you see high likelihood and high impact, this is the aspirational space. This is the place we'd all like to be and the ideal. And so what we tried to do is test the boundaries between sort of a moderate amount or little happening all the way up to what would be the ideal. How would we want to work and how would we want to occupy our real estate and the workplaces we're going to continue to work in. And so that is the framework we laid out in order to be able to assess 4 different futures. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg, or actually, no, one more. Sorry about that. In order to frame the scenarios, we looked at the driving forces. So for instance, what are the key criteria we would use in order to frame each scenario? So political impacts, economic considerations, the social dynamics and how they're changing in order to influence a scenario. How does technology play a role in the way we develop scenarios? And then clearly both the work environment and the location and how they're going to potentially shift as we walk through each different one. And so as a result, translating that grid and the forces that we came up with 4 headlines that we'd like to share our insight around. The first is back to 2019, which really plays in that status quo bucket. And then going up the y-axis, the second is the digital office. The third is disruption is the new normal. And the fourth is what we call adapting to change. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg to present our findings on the first scenario back to 2019. And so Greg, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I get the hard one to explain, right? How were things back in 2019, right? And if you think about this idea of the 4 scenarios we have and the spectrum of different options we have, this option seemed the least likely to occur, that we'd actually revert to the way we were back in 2019. Think about that. Just 7 months ago, the concept of working from home was more of a novelty than a necessity. And so we've really changed that sort of experience that we have with work. You think of also the word social distancing wasn't even in our vocabulary 7 months ago. And before, the idea of 2019 was you have the traditional real estate model where you have hub and spoke facilities where people commute primarily to a place of employment on a daily basis. And then you find also this sort of model where really AI and technology are being adopted, but really not because we have to, but because we're thinking it might make us incrementally better than we were before. What's also interesting is the average office size or space that a tech worker would use was about 225 square feet previously, and it had been decreasing down to 175 or 125 square feet per person. So we see this kind of condensing of people, the absolute opposite of what's going on right now with COVID-19 and going forward. So if you look at the impact going with COVID-19, and one of the options here of going back to 2019, the impact we call it as really neutral, because it's just reverting to back what we used to have. It's not changing. And then what I think is also interesting is with the relationship between the associate or the employee and the company is really the company determines the space. The company determines how the employee will work in 2019. Right now, it's quite different, and how we work and where we work and what we're dressed and when we're working. So the office really seen as a place of physical collaboration versus virtual collaboration. And now that's completely broken. Will we go back? I don't think so. And this team together collectively agreed this is the least likely scenario, that this idea of really having to return to an office in the same format as we had in 2019 is not really a viable option. We'll continue to go forward, and the idea of globalization and the idea of utilizing space as kind of an accessory to really the work experience is way we will continue to evolve. Oh, Chris highlighted to me also, the employees don't really have a voice in determining the work experience, as I highlighted also. That's really important, in fact, this model here. It's company determined. So the action plan is we just do everything we did in the past. We'd be sourcing talent the same way. Flex workspace would not be something which is an integral part. It's kind of, again, a sideline sort of nice to have versus a must have. And the technology platforms are evolving incrementally again versus what we face with COVID-19 is this sudden impact and disruption. So that's one end of the spectrum. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum is a completely digital office, which, Fran, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. So I would say, we sort of collectively agree that this is probably the second least likely option. And it's, as Greg mentioned, it's on the exact opposite end of the spectrum as the office is back to 2019. And some of the reasons for why I think this is so unlikely, this scenario, is because we're just not there yet in terms of some technology advancements that would sort of be fundamental to this scenario. And so it's a low probability, but very high impact scenario. And one that many of you have likely discussed with your friends or over the dinner table with your family over the last few months, which is really what happens if we never go back to the physical office, right? This is the matrix scenario where the office truly becomes a digital twin of the physical state. And so in this scenario, you might wake up from whichever location suits you best, so long as that location has great internet and great connectivity, and you'll plug into the digital workspace in whatever form factor that might be. So today that's probably working through emails, video streaming, Zoom or Teams, but tomorrow that could be strapping in your headset or and using AR, VR, or other novel technologies. And so you might even log into a virtual workplace. And if we think about the gaming world, and you'll have an avatar that shows sort of your digital whereabouts, what type of work you're doing, who you're meeting with, and we'll sort of, in essence, actually be able to develop a digital identity that is sort of connected to us, but independent of your physical self. And so in this reality, we're digital first, and physical space is only rarely utilized really for purpose-driven work that cannot take place online. So think maybe assembling major hardware for physical products. And so CRE here will really be integrated and overtaken by technology. And for physical workspaces that are required for things like assembly of hardware or other means, this type of space would be provided on demand. And so we think that flexible workspace would be pretty key in this new model to support the required infrastructure. So to talk about some of the CRE impacts on the CRE portfolio, really across the board here, the use of traditional space decreases along with all the associated metrics, the space metrics and financials that go along with it. So we'll see a drastic reduction in locations of all sizes. We'll see a drastic reduction of CapEx and OpEx, at least as it pertains to real estate, right? And so one area that we might see a material uptick is flex, as the portfolio shifts to variable or on-demand space only when needed. That type of space will likely be flexible workspace. And so while this is a low probability scenario, a couple sort of signposts that we could look for that would sort of accelerate the likelihood of this scenario are if major sector leaders, major Fortune 100 companies continue to announce long-term remote first and remote only policies, or if we really have data that comes back in the next 6 months that supports that this period of disruption has actually resulted in not only increased productivity for a period of time, but for a long period of time, as well as employee happiness and well-being. And so lastly, technology infrastructure, as I mentioned at the top of this, is key to this. So to the extent that we have good digital infrastructure, we have really the ability to procure real estate services on demand, that might also enable this outcome. And so to take advantage of the benefits of this new reality, companies will really need to start sourcing talent from anywhere, right? So to do this, companies will need to invest heavily in technology and digital workspace infrastructure so they could turn space on anywhere, so anyone could sort of become functional and really transition from a traditional or hub and spoke composition to a dynamic digital driven one. And at the center of this new strategy, I think, would be technology and choice. And so while this scenario outlines a bit of a dramatic leap from where we are today, I think probably the reality lies a little bit closer in to where we are today. So the next scenario, I think, highlights this a little bit, and we'll look at that in disruption is the new normal. And so Keith, why don't I pass it over to you?
Great, thanks, Fran. And I think that's a great setup. I think that the distinction between what Fran just talked about in this scenario is that digital is a heart of this, but also place is part of it as well. It's the blending of the physical and the digital. That's what this disruption is the new normal scenario is all about. We start by saying location is irrelevant, which means that you can be productive and work anywhere, both socially and for your work. So there's a blending of your social life and your work life. There's a blending of your hours. There's a blending of your digital presence and your physical presence. And being able to build a portfolio that helps support that is key here. There's a lot of choice given to employees, particularly folks who are mostly working in the digital world. Employees can choose when, where, how, with whom they work. And we also think that within the scenario that people will choose where they want to live based on the lifestyle they want rather than the employer who is employing them. So we might see a migration of people from cities to less urban areas, or from the north to the south, or we don't know. We're going to let this play out. But if you are unencumbered from your job because it's forcing you to live in a certain place, you might choose to live somewhere else. We might be able to see some of that. Because it's so dynamic, also, we could see companies hiring and assembling a small workforce to do a project, like make a movie, do that, and then disband that workforce. So it's almost a kind of a outcome-based assemblage of people to deliver things, and then those people move on to the next place. And because you can access talent anywhere in the world, you're able to build the best teams from the best folks around. The impacts on the portfolio are really, we still see square footages going down, the number of locations possibly going down, the number of seats in the office. Even the importance of the headquarters is probably going to be in question here, although you'll still need that. And let me talk about that a little bit. Place is still a part of this. It's an important component of this scenario, which says that when you do choose to go to a place, it must be an engaging place to go that gives you the things that a digital world can't give you. Gathering, knowledge transfer, cultural touchstones, onboarding new people, developing institutional knowledge, all of these things work better in a physical location. So in this scenario, we don't think physical goes away. We think it just becomes repurposed for those kinds of things that best support things the physical workplace can support. So we think that flex, as in the previous scenario, will go up, choices for where people can work, and small offices. We think that there'll probably be places that pop up where people will drop into small offices that are run by the company that employs them, so that when they need to get away from their home office or other places, they can go to a central place and still do work. Things that we need to look out for are, when talent starts to migrate a lot, that'll start to be revealed that this scenario is starting to become real, and that organizations start to think about hiring anywhere. And to prepare for this, the action is really just about, how do you think about your global talent strategy, not just your regional talent strategy? How do you get your workplace and your portfolio to be agile to support that kind of location agnostic kind of situation? And can you start to understand what the people you want to hire need, not in the physical location, but in their work experience, their digital and their physical work experience, and how can you best deliver that? So I'd like to pass it on to scenario 4. Brett.
Excellent. Thank you, Keith. So scenario 4, this is adapting to change, right? So this is our high probability, low impact scenario. And it's really a hybrid of what Greg talked about in the back to 2019 and what Fran and Keith just took us towards in those more kind of futuristic scenarios. And so while it's a hybrid, we still, even in this scenario, see the gravitational center of the organization shifting away from the physical footprint and towards distributed work. And you heard Keith and Fran talk a lot about employee choice. While we still see some of that in this scenario, we actually see a bifurcation in the labor pool where the highest end, most sought after, most kind of technical talent still definitely has that choice. And even that within the white collar labor pool, call it the top 10 to 15%, they have that choice. Whereas more of your worker bees with more, I'll call it commoditized administrative skills, they're still expected to be in the physical office from a cultural perspective. So consequently, we'll expect some portfolio strategy to shift, just not as dramatically as in scenarios 2 and 3. And in this scenario also, technology continues to advance, but I'll call it more of a linear fashion versus the exponential development that would need to take place for us to have, digital avatars, as Fran was speaking to. And finally, we believe we'll see an increase in kind of the on and near shoring, but predominantly for essential operations and processes, where again, that talent that, has the most, I guess, is the rare factor in the value equation, they still ultimately have choice. So from a real estate perspective, we still see this as that hub and satellite scenario. And while the arrows, will look pretty familiar to what we just saw on the last page from an impact perspective, the degree to which we'll see a decline in square footage, location, and seats, et cetera, won't be as dramatic. And in this scenario, we do also see an increase in small offices and flex to accommodate that top tier talent. So what are the signposts that are going to indicate that, this is the path that we're going to? Again, I think there's that supply demand imbalance for those most sought after skill sets, right? The AI, automation, predictive analytics. There's still going to be a supply demand imbalance, and thus virtual work becomes a must in order to attract that talent. Another piece would be, I think, this segmentation by function to inform the work from home strategy, and other factors like living situation and demographics, which have become a bigger, more relevant component, as a result of COVID. And in addition to things like activity-based work continuing to grow and continued technological advancement, I think the inherent uncertainty that we're seeing from a lot of organizations regarding their top line, building that dynamic flexibility into, some of their cost structure, and ultimately how that flows down to both real estate and their labor. So from an action plan perspective, what can we do to prepare? I think it's critical that you develop a talent sourcing strategy to understand not just who you have today and who you're going to need in the future, but how are you going to go about acquiring that talent? Another key piece is what we call codifying your labor force. So really understanding the key characteristics, again, from a skill set and demographic perspective, so that you kind of have that information in your back pocket so that you know which way to turn when you start to see the world or the outcome start to take shape. Another key one is, I think, this increased focus on flexibility. And I kind of mentioned this a bit, but this is something we're even doing on our team. So not just wanting more flexibility within your real estate, but even within your labor force, and thinking through, okay, so we maybe don't have the need for full-time predictive analytics or advanced data visualization today, but how do we start to build those relationships and understand those capabilities via contract work for specific projects? And then the last one that I'll touch on here, which I think is really critical, is new processes and management techniques, which I think Keith and his team and some of the work that the Workplace team has really done a great job of unearthing regarding the criticality, especially for your younger labor force who's working remotely, having those stand-up meetings in the mornings to make sure that there's clarity on priorities and that they have the resources they need, both technologically and otherwise, to be successful. So again, kind of wrapping up this scenario 4, I would call this, you saw it on one of the earlier slides in our diagram, but this is more of kind of the evolutionary scenario versus something as revolutionary as what Fran and Keith talked through in scenarios 2 and 3.
Great, thanks, Brett. And so hopefully we painted a picture of 4 different worlds that might unfold over the next 5 years. And what we'd like to do is now turn it over to you for a poll. So Amanda, if that can, thank you. We'd like your input, given what you just heard from our subject matter experts and presenting the different dimensions of what we see unfolding. We'd love to hear your feedback. So listed are the 4 scenarios. Again, 1, back to 2019, Greg's scenario of saying this is the one that's the easiest and probably won't unfold. Then secondly, the office is digital, with really pushing heavy with technology leading and the office becoming supporting in terms of our work. The third is disruption is the new normal, really looking at that balance and driving technology and real estate in order to find that harmony in how we work and where we work. And then the 4th, adapting to change, that Brett just walked through. And then the 5th one is another scenario not listed. Is there something that you think might unfold? We love to hear your feedback and see if there are additional scenarios. So in the chat function, in the Q&A function, in your toolbar, go in and type in a scenario you think that might unfold, and we could take that on and have that as part of the conversation. So love your feedback. Great. So the poll results coming in so far, adapting to change, the evolutionary scenario is really unfolding. Don't see any risk takers out there and saying that seeing if there's something alternative that's coming up. Would love to see somebody throw their hat in the ring and see if there's something our team could take on. But in the meantime, just to the panel, it's interesting when we did our poll, which one was going to emerge as being the top vote getter. Just curious from our team, number 4, adapting to change, seems to be rising to the top, with disruption as the new normal, coming in a strong second place. Would love to get feedback from the team and see if there's anything you'd like to share based on more information or sharing more information of how we got to our priorities and some of the dialogue that we had. So anyone on the panel like to jump in and start that conversation?
Yeah, sure, Chris. I'll take a stab, since it was, I guess, this adapting to change that folks thought was the most likely. I think as we were talking through this, part of the way that we landed there as a group, to agree with the panelists, was that, they say technology has a greater disruption in the long term, but less disruption in the short term than most people expect. So I think that was a big piece of the story. And then I think the other piece, I guess tying together that technology and labor component is inherently, technology always goes up and to the right? We go through various economic cycles, but technology is always continuing to advance. And inherently, what does technology enable? It enables fewer people to create more of the value in the world, right? I mean, back in Neolithic times, right, there wasn't one caveman could only have as much impact as the people that he could, they could hear his grunts when he was, yelling at them. And now you've got things like Facebook and other unicorns that are, started by teams of, 15 or 20 people. So I think that may be one of the big drivers.
And I would add to that, in the fact that we've already felt some of this, right? We've realized and recognized now our ability to adapt to things that come in that we didn't anticipate. Nobody sat back in 2019 and anticipated COVID-19. So I think this scenario is relatable just on what we've had to go through in 2020. And so I think this a little closer to heart because we've lived through a lot of this, quickness and resulting in it, how fast can you adapt to change?
I think this future was always on the horizon. COVID just accelerated us toward it.
Right. So this is the one we can touch and feel and closest to envisioning where we might go next. I might just ask as a follow-up, Fran, on the office is digital, seeing that it came in a distant last, or along with back to 2019, sharing that distinction. Just love your feedback as we were delivering that, developing that scenario, what the thoughts were of the team, or what additional commentary you can make based on scenario 3 and scenario 4 popping to the top.
Yeah. So I think while some of us might think that could ultimately be a scenario that the world heads to long term, I think what we all sort of agreed, and looks like our audience validated, is that we just aren't there yet. We don't literally have the technology yet at our fingertips to enable that type of operating model. It's still too clunky to work from home forever. We could do heads down work productively, but I think there's some natural limitations to remote work around collaboration, brainstorming, management meetings. And so I think until there's advancements in technology that truly sort of remove the friction and the cultural impediments of remote work, we're going to be in this sort of intermediary stage. And I would say the same is true of on-demand space. One of the things that I mentioned in that scenario is that to the extent we do use physical real estate, it's probably not going to be long-term leases and expensive build-outs. It's going to be more of a flex style, on-demand style procurement of space, only when people need it for an hour a day. And I think that service model for how to sort of tap into that type of real estate is not fully mature yet for large organizations to use and to enable their employees to use without much friction and annoyance.
Yeah, and I think as Melody will share with us as well, the challenge of what's your culture, how do we collaborate, how do we innovate in a sustainable way is something that I think in order to bridge the technology gap, we're really going to have to see advancements in order to get there. Great. So on that note, we'll turn it over to Melody to talk about, these are the scenarios. Where do we see the shifts or the impacts happening from each of the scenarios as they unfold? Melody?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we wanted to take a look at these side by side once the scenarios are developed to see how our business and the real estate will be impacted. On this page, a shift towards the red is going to be a negative impact. A shift to the right would be positive. If it's in the amber color, neutral, it either means that there's no change or that the good and the bad are weighing each other out and there's a net neutral. When looking at these variables, we looked at business, and that included things like our resiliency, our management style, culture, collaboration. For employees, it included things like our career development, work-life balance, recruiting and retention. CRE finance included operating and capital expenses. Geography looked at not only the locations, but also the commute associated with it. Operations considered our data security, technology acceptance, infrastructure. And real estate looked at both the footprint, but also our portfolio management, our flexible space inclusion, and our location quality. Going back to 2019 would be neutral at best. As Greg spoke to, we've made a lot of changes over the last 7 months already in a short amount of time. Going back would erase some of the progress we've already made. Our business would be less resilient. It could be a major potential new disruption for our employees who have gotten used to their new work environments. There are a lot who are still struggling working from home, but to now change everything and go back to the way we're working is not going to be as seamless as it might be in some of the other scenarios. And the technology adoption that we've taken on over the last few months, it really has supported business. It's technology that's been available to us, but as Keith just mentioned, is something that we haven't picked up as quickly. For us to move away from that is going to take us back a little bit too from some of the progress and some of the benefits we've seen from technology. The office's digital scenario is going to have the greatest impact for volatility. Obviously, our operating and real estate costs are going to go down, but the cost of that is going to be our brand and our culture. How do we support and how do we develop culture when we don't have the space, which was our brand expression, when we don't have space for our teams to come together, to collaborate, to spur productivity? Disruption is a new normal is the most aspirational of the four scenarios. This is where our optimal business needs meet our optimal employee needs. Our employees are able to choose how and where they work. They're happy in doing so. Our operating costs, our real estate costs come down. We're able to just lean on the activity-based scenarios that we need. And while it might be the most difficult to get there, when we do get there, our portfolio is going to be the most optimized. Adapting to change, whether or not we end up here, this is going to be a stepping stone for some of these other scenarios. And that's a really positive thing. We're going to have the space support the way it has. It'll support our employees. It'll support our brand, our culture, the way it has in the past. But we're able to rework a lot of our footprint to better support activity-based working and better support the way employees want to work moving forward. And to talk a little bit more about the impacts on traditional real estate models, I'm going to hand it off to Ron.
Thanks, Melody. So real estate models come in three basic flavors as shown here. They're typically established as a result of growth, geography, and topology, and access to available inventory. Most of these models are developed intentionally to provide the organization with a comparative advantage. Rarely do they occur organically, though this certainly has been the case in the past. What you have here from left to right is the hub and spoke model, which features a strong central headquarters and operations function surrounded by satellite nodes. Those nodes typically provide touchdown space, support, and have traditionally been used by sales organizations as outposts testing new markets. The traditional campus in the middle is a very intentional setting and function. All talent, all functions, all occupancy requirements are in one place. This provides strong cultural dispersion across the population. Think Google in Mountain View or Apple in Cupertino. You know this one. And then finally on the right side is clusters, either urban or suburban. Now, these are typically occupied by organizations whose growth is incremental and large takedown of spaces is really not justified. The organization wants to stay in the same metro area for a variety of reasons, hence why there's no movement away to other geographies or other areas. Because location is irrelevant in both scenarios 2 and 3, we feel that none of the models are going to fare all that well in any of those two scenarios. So we make the argument that the hub and spoke model is pretty much status quo in one. And then in scenario 3, disruption is the new normal because of the combination of at-home workers and hub. It'll be augmented with flexible work product. We feel that each model under the scenario 1 really is supported by that there was a reason the organization chose scenario 1 in the first place, right? And that continues if we go back to 2019, that each model supports that organization because in effect, we've gone back to where we were. We don't see that as very likely, but c'est la vie. For scenario 4, adapting to change, the devil really is in the details for each organization which chooses the model that they do. We feel that employees will be more in the driver's seat. So a hub and spoke model will work well for organizations that employ a wide variety of geographically dispersed teams. Whereas a traditional campus will continue to work for that organization that chose it in the first place. The same rationale holds true for the cluster model. Incremental growth or even exponential growth can be accommodated by a traditional or flexible lease models. So those are the impacts that we see to traditional lease models or traditional real estate models based upon the different scenarios. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Greg Healy.
Thanks, Ron. So if you step back and look at all these scenarios presented today, you can see that no matter which path we take, it does shift the relationship between people and workspace. And as we took the poll a few minutes ago and looked at the 4 distinct models presented to you, we kind of collectively said, we're presenting this as 4 distinct models, but really it's a continuum. And where each company sits on that continuum is going to be based upon their ability to pivot, to adapt technology, but also it's going to be dependent upon the human nature here. How willing are we to really embrace a fully digital office space? And I think that's really why the scenario 2 received low reviews. It's really hard to envision us working completely in an isolated model when we're such, social beings by nature. But we do believe that on this continuum, if you look at back to 2019, you have the highest amount of space you're utilizing as a business. You have dedicated workspace for everybody. And as you move to the right, using less space as a whole, but the interesting thing is you find that your ability, your freedom as an office worker, I'm going to say specifically, is increasing because your personal determination to determine how you're going to work and where you're going to work is really shifting from the company more to the individual. It's kind of the unit of one, and the office space is also decreasing from the bulk sort of campus model or traditional model to a unit of one. And where that unit sits and how it works is really dependent upon the individual and their skill sets and their ability to adapt to this change. So we think that as we slide to the right here, there will be hiccups along the way, and technology and both human nature will push us back up and to the left. But I think, even after COVID-19, what happens when the next pandemic arrives? How will we change? How will we shift? And also, will technology versus being a hindrance to this and to the shift in a digital office space, will it actually be an accelerator at a certain point? And we'll be embracing it more. So next slide, please.
Hey, I'd like to pause there. There was a good question that came in the chat, which I think is relevant to sort of this part of the conversation I'd like to share with the panelists, which is what are those steps transition? What would it look like to get to that digital VR avatar office? So given where we live in a highly physical world today, even though we're working virtually or in some third place, for the most part currently, what would the steps be, I guess, to get to that office is digital? So like to see if someone can jump in and sort of maybe provide some insight on that. Fran, I think you mentioned some of the signposts, maybe reiterating what we would need to look for in order to understand when that's unfolding. Maybe just to reiterate that.
Sure. Yeah. So one of them I talked to a little bit earlier, which is having the technology that's seamless, that's in place, that enables this type of working environment. The other piece that I didn't touch on, but I saw the question in the chat and I was sort of thinking about it. It's a great question. We could have the technology, but what other challenges do we have to overcome? And I think, one is it mandatory to provide this type of operating model if we want to attract and retain talent? Is this what employees are demanding? And I think not until that becomes a widespread part of kind of the critical playbook to attracting and retaining talent is offering this type of distributed working and this digital first working, will that be sort of a core and critical part of what companies offer. And I think once that triggers and it'll be a process that you might start with sort of high skilled technology jobs and then work its way down to more sort of commoditized jobs. But I think it's really going to be driven by the employee and what they're asking for, and that will have an impact up the chain.
Great. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, to piggyback on that, and Kristen, with your comment and your question there, I think another challenge we have is that you mentioned, if you're not physically in the office, are you really working? And I think that we're going to be having this challenge of as we become more digital and really remove from the physical space of our employment, and it's more about basically the activity-based concept, we become more disassociated with the organization. So the organization has to really think about how do we deliver the right sort of experience to our, not just our customers, but also our employees to keep them engaged. I think that's something that a lot of companies are still struggling with today. We're forced into the scenario that we're in today, but now it's kind of a catch-up period, and companies have to shift and pivot and change and adapt to what will this look like, and how do we keep our employees engaged, and how do we create the environment so they can be successful independent of where they're working.
Yeah, and
Chris,
something I would add to oh, go ahead, Keith.
Sorry, Brett, I would just, you've kind of opened up a big thing there, Greg, and I think that's exactly right. In work that we're doing with companies right now, a culture of trust is very important to have in place if people are working in a distributed way. And we don't have, direct line of sight into productivity and what those metrics are. And what we've found is that a lot of companies have that culture of trust, and we're now building on the bank account that's been built up for that. But that bank account might be waning a bit, as we don't get together physically. So we have to be mindful and intentional in how we build up that idea of trust and keep it going. Because as we're separated physically, we start to erode that possibly. And then the other bit is, I think, just like you mentioned, and I want to reiterate, is being very intentional about how we stay connected with each other socially. This is an important piece of the glue for a company. Being able to understand when somebody is feeling isolated or needs some additional help, both for work or just as a human being. Those kinds of things are sort of automatic when you bump into folks in a hallway, not so automatic when you're separated physically. And so we need to be very intentional about how we still make sure that the human is taken care of in this new work environment.
Yeah, I
Totally
think those
agree.
are all great.
Yeah,
And the last point, go ahead, Brett. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, the one thing I was going to add to Francesco's point, from a very practical standpoint, to see that we're going to the office as digital, is we don't find a vaccine, right? Because I think we're going to get to the office as digital much quicker than we would have otherwise, because what did Fran say? We don't have the technology. Well, in order to have the technology, we need the innovation, and innovation is needed. The prerequisite for it is investment. And what is the prerequisite for investment? Is market size. And what just blew up in the last 7 months was the market size of people that the market sees for people working from home. So I think that's another critical element. And then to his point on, we'll see that adoption at the high end of the tech curve. I mean, I think those most sought after occupations that I referred to, those are very frequently early adopters. So as we do get, practical solutions to some of this, relatively seemingly far out technology, I think it could really be a strategic advantage for companies to start adopting that as a way to attract that top end of the talent tier.
All great points. And I would encourage the audience to share any additional questions around these topics as we sort of are rounding into the last phase of the discussion. So feel free to keep asking, and we'll try to entertain those as we flow through to the end of the session. So with that, on to this question of what's the voyage? How are we going to see these things? I'll turn it over to Greg to give us a description of where we see sort of the next steps, or what are the signs? How are we envisioning the kind of question that was being asked? How do we see that transferring to where we're headed, and how does that translate to some of the results? Greg?
Yeah, as we discussed this internally and spent, last 2 months really going over this in these models, we came to the conclusion that we're still voyagers out there. We're out there discovering what this new land's going to look like, what this new landscape will be for us, and how are we going to survive, and how are we going to excel in this new landscape. Looking at the 4 different scenarios and the propensity of any of them happening, what we did find as common themes were really that the acceleration of adoption of technology is a critical aspect of this. And we're living this today. All of us on this Zoom call right now are living proof of this. We also think that on the positive side of the ledger, we'll see this heightened focus on the individual and control of his or her own fortunes. As Brett mentioned, it might be a bifurcated model. Those the highly skilled will be more in control, or they can be agnostic in where they're working from. But on the other side, we'll see a flattening of the global labor pools. Those sort of really commoditized work streams can be shipped or be performed virtually anywhere in the world, and that might be accelerated through this process. And I think, to the point of combining this virtual and physical aspect, we still believe there's a strong sense of place that's required as we transition to this new paradigm. But the space will be more flexible, and it'd be a higher level of brand expression in a space. We might go to the space for some in-person collaborative working on certain days of the week, certain groups coming in. But at the same time, we're not there yet, again, as social beings, to completely give up the office and work completely virtually. So we're really we are out there exploring, kind of understand what's going on, and we keep looking to the future to see, how do we adapt, how do we change, and how do we really embrace what's around the corner here.
Thanks,
And
Greg.
Linda.
And as we emerge out of this grand experiment in many ways and look at these key sort of drivers that are continue to unfold around technology, space, labor, Linda, what are the types of questions you think companies ought to be considering now? Getting back to, connecting some of the theme of the panel and the question that was posed. What are the things that companies ought to be thinking about today as we're continuing to emerge from the pandemic?
Thanks, Chris. So what we've done is looked at, trying to plan for the shift, right? It's happened. It's going to continue to evolve. We created 3 primary categories of questions that you can start asking of yourself as well as of the business. So from a business perspective, really understanding, has your business plan shifted? And if so, how has that shifted? So, really, keeping a close watch on the business activity and how the business is reacting to the change that's already occurred, and maybe having those conversations with what's going to come up next, or where are they thinking it's going to go next. Assessing the tools that you have enabled for your team to ensure business continuity as well as your team's productivity, and maybe understanding what else is needed. From an overall work perspective, looking at what evidence has already come forward, whether it's through data and analytics, to really understand what decisions or what do you need in order to make these decisions. Everybody's talked earlier about really understanding the productivity and the throughput of the teams. So what do you need to continue to evolve the knowledge and the certainty that continues to grow and is there? Do you understand how the virtual work is going to be rolled out in your organization? Most of us had to react very quickly and make sure Teams or Zoom was installed on everybody's laptop and available for them to use on a daily basis. But how does that look to continue to be rolled out across your organization? Understanding how much and what type of talent is needed and where it needs to be. So you heard Brett and others mention, a shift a little bit and being able to go out and seek talent where they're at versus trying to always bring them to where you are. So understanding again what talent is needed and potentially where it needs to be. From an overall place perspective, looking at your portfolio, have you tested the portfolio to understand and assess the degrees of change? How much flexibility is there now versus what flexibility you need to be in the portfolio in the future? Do you know where there is an opportunity for change or variability in the portfolio? So again, being able to proactively identify that flexibility in the portfolio will be important for the future. And then at the end, really understanding which locations you're tied to and why. If you've got the headquarters location, a center of excellence that's been established, understanding the dynamics, the business dynamics for that location selection, and does it need to stay? And at times, potentially even challenging that with everything else that's happening above. So just a few points to ponder and to really start to, get underneath and ask the business as you continue to evolve your plan of the future to 2025. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I mean, that internal client or customer journey, or even as an outsourced provider, asking these kind of questions of the businesses you're working with, are really critical to maybe not have the answer, but have the options. And that's really what we're trying to lay out for you today is what should you be thinking about and what should you be prioritizing as we, again, continue to think about what the next steps are for business and ultimately the portfolio. So with that, we're going to turn it to some Q&A. I think we have about 5 minutes left. Wow, this went quickly, but so thanks for all the panelists. So maybe we'll launch into a question and have Brett kick us off with around talent attraction and retention. You know, how is the attraction and retention of talent going to shift post-COVID? What would be different per each of the scenarios? So maybe Brett, you can lead us off on that topic.
Sure. Yeah, and we touched on a bit of this earlier, you know, in the conversation. But I think one of the key takeaways, right, is proximity, right? Proximity to place. Obviously, if we're in scenario one, you know, you're still pulling from the same geographic pool as your physical location. At the other end of the spectrum, when the office is digital, you can find that talent anywhere around the world. So I think that's probably the biggest delineator between the two. However, I would say they're also, you know, I think by company, as Greg called out, you know, this isn't just a scenario, are we going to ultimately end up 1, 2, 3, or 4? It's, you know, somewhere on a matrix almost of, you know, some hybrid of the group. And, you know, just on yesterday, I was on a call with a, you know, large global insurer, and they talked about how their CEO, when he first came in 2 years ago, was very anti-work from home. Basically, you know, anybody who had already worked from home, he wasn't going to make them come into the office, but he wasn't, you know, basically nobody else could get that, you know, that type of grant. And in light of COVID, he's now saying that, you know, we're not getting rid of our office, but basically he wants to open up the freedom for basically anyone to work from home. So I think a lot of people have realized through this, you know, the grand experiment, I think, is, as Keith put it, that there are, you know, there are definitely major benefits to working from home. And ultimately, I think because so many people have found that they really like working this way, I think it's going to need to be a big piece of your talent strategy going forward for all organizations. But, you know, as Keith and, you know, the workplace team's data has shown, it's going to really be critical on, you know, job function, you know, living situation, you know, are you, you know, immune compromised? There's a lot of different factors that kind of go into that equation of who are the right people to do that. So, you know, that's just kind of a few thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Brett. Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that there's, you know, another element to this that we had discussed when we were thinking about the scenarios that hasn't come up yet today is how do we support employees in their career development? That's going to be a big part of the retention. It's something we had considered. And, you know, a lot of, you know, to Keith's point, we've built up this trust with one another. When we were in the office, there was an element of osmosis of picking things up from each other to just by proximity, finding mentors and mentees. And, you know, when we get into these higher impact scenarios, companies need to be really focused on how to be proactive in that development for their employees. And that's going to be a greater part of encouraging retention beyond what we've considered traditionally in the past.
I agree quickly with Melody, what you were saying. And we looked more towards activity-based work versus kind of company determined work. What we will see, or what we need to see, is we need to see the leveraging of data. That means data about our employees also, so that we can deliver from a company perspective a more personalized experience and make sure we're giving our associates really what they need for their personal development to keep them engaged, because they don't have that physical space to associate with the brand identity. So I think that businesses will have to understand just like we look at, you know, understanding our customers better, we'll have to focus also one eye on the customer, but one eye also on our associates, even sharper, so we understand what their needs are to keep them engaged and keep them developing and really, you know, buying into the corporate identity if you don't have that physical space which defines you.
On that last note, maybe just the last comment, and I'm going to toss it to Keith, which is a lot of people on the call are saying, probably thinking, how does the actual office change? And I know that's a huge conversation, but just any comments or thoughts on that, Keith, to close us out on what you think this is going to mean from the overall use or way people are going to adapt the office of the future.
I think a common theme that will not change is that we're humans, and humans thrive on getting together for certain activities. Being together in rooms creates values that are difficult sometimes to quantify. And so I think building places for that to occur is important. And again, I mentioned them, gathering, knowledge sharing, building social cohesion, touchstones for culture, reinforcing values and behaviors. These are important things that happen in a physical setting. So there's a reason that places exist. If you have to do heads down work for 4 hours, well, you can do that at home or you can do that at another place, but you come to the office to gather and be together. And we've seen this more and more, attorneys who can work remotely because they do a lot of heads down work like to come to the office so they have good conversations with each other. Engineers, who do a lot of really heads down focused work are more creative when they bump into each other. And so these kinds of situations need to be continued. Building a virtual hallway where you bump into each other hasn't been built yet. It might, but I think that the physical reasons need to still be there. And the questions always come up is like, well, how do we pay for this? How do we change this? And the point is, the past workplace wasn't perfect either. It's always going to evolve. We were always going to invest in changing our workplace. Now we're starting to get a different idea about what that can be. That investment just needs to be redirected into the right places. And that's the most important bit. We're going to spend money on the workplace. Let's just make sure we're spending it on the right things that have the biggest impact.
Well, thank you. And thank you, IAOP, and thanks to our panelists for both the investment of time, bringing their high intellect, and certainly having a great dialogue and conversation about what might be unfolding. And with that, everyone have a great rest of their day, and thanks so much. Take care.